Some time ago, Blizzard made a survey asking the community what they would like to see in a future Classic Plus. But in this survey, Blizzard asked the most out-of-touch questions. Questions like, would you want flying mounts in Classic Vanilla? And this got some people really fired up. So the community took matters into their own hands. And in response, they made a real Classic Plus survey. Shout out to the guys at Countdown to Classic. So in today's video, I'll be going over the results of this survey while I give you guys my take on the questions asked. So let's dive into it and take a look at what the community actually want to see in a future Classic Plus. Alright guys, welcome back to part 2 of our Classic Plus community survey deep dive, where we explore what thousands of players want from a potential Classic Plus version of World of Warcraft. So without any further ado, let's just dive right back to it, especially for PvP. How many classes do you think need sprucing up in terms of viability and being enjoyable to play from their 1.12 version? And the majority says all of them could be improved, and close to that 32% says mostly the hybrids, and 20% says 5+, most classes need improvements. 10% say the very fringe specs classes, and then only 3% say 3%. And I think that everyone expects some sort of class tunement when we're talking about Classic Plus. Everyone wants a viable enhancement shaman, a viable retribution paladin, not only in PvE but also in PvP, making sure that still every class is balanced in between their specs in PvP, and maybe might not be equal in terms of PvE, but closer than what they are right now, because there's a big difference between a warrior and an enhancement shaman in PvE when it comes to raids, and the same goes for retribution paladins and many other specs, and those I'd agree need some tuning. I think I agree with the majority here. I think if you tune some classes but leave some other classes out of the tuning or the adding new stuff, right, then you're gonna feel like then those classes will be the tuned up classes are going to be the most played, and then you're gonna have a problem because everyone would want to play the classes that have been changed, right? So just from that aspect and from that point of view, I say that you need to do something to every class. You need to improve something with every spec. So I agree here with the majority. In regards to rotation and abilities available, are you happy with how your class plays in Season of Discovery at level 60? And 40% say yes, 30% say somewhat, 20% say I have not played Season of Discovery, and then 10% or 11% says no. And I'm probably in the minority here. In regards to rotation and abilities available, are you happy with? I hate the rotation of Hunter. I hate having to throw traps as the best option for ranged Hunter DPS. Oh, then go play melee. I don't want to play melee Hunter. I picked a Hunter because I want to be at range. But many other classes, they did get more options, right? You have your enhancement shaman, you have your elemental shaman, and they're both viable in PvE now, which they weren't really before. Enhancement shaman wasn't really that good or viable in PvE. So in a way, they did change things to be more viable in PvE, but they just fucked up so many other things. So I wouldn't look to Sword as a good example of what to do in a Classic Plus. Moving on, At which point do you feel most classes were fleshed out and enjoyable to play? In vanilla, in TPC, Wrath Lich King, Cataclysm, Mob, and beyond, a mystical mix of multiple sort attempted. Yeah, I'd say something between Wrath Lich King and TPC is, in my opinion, where I feel they nailed it the most. And it seems like I agree with the majority. Most people say Wrath Lich King, and then 26% say TPC, 33% Wrath Lich King, and 21% a mix of multiple. And then we have 10% approximately say vanilla, 4% say Mob and beyond, 5% say Cataclysm. I think they dumbed down the talents in Cataclysm, right? And you had to finish one talent tree completely in order to move on to the next one. So they killed the hybrid specs, kind of. So, but I think overall PvP balance in Cataclysm was quite good. And that's also when they introduced focus to hunters, which is thematically makes most sense in my opinion. In Classic Plus, I'd love to see focus given to hunters instead of mana. Because why would you use mana on a hunter? That's equivalent to a rogue using mana or a warrior using mana. So hunter makes sense to have focus. There are some things I like about Cataclysm. So maybe I'm in the ballpark of all three. I like the simplicity of TPC, and I like some of the additions to Cataclysm, but I like mostly the talent trees of Wrath of the Lich King, because I feel like that's where you had the most options to make something interesting. And that's also where I feel like the numbers weren't too high and too big, and most classes could shine in PvP in this expansion, and we're also really strong in PvE. Right, moving on. Would you like talent trees to be developed / reworked to make more specs and playstyles viable and engaging? And of course, the majority votes yes, of course. And I agree with this one. Only 6%, 16% votes no. And the next one, should developers use PvE output as a primary source for balancing due to the community's priority towards that area of game? And I'm really saddened to see that the majority votes yes to this one. But of course that is going to be the measurement. But I think I'm unsure. 52% says yes. 30% says I'm unsure, and I agree with that. And 17.5% say no. And I say I'm unsure because for me the end game is about PvP. So as a PvPer, I don't mind if I'm beneath everyone else in PvE as long as PvP is balanced. I don't want to be the best. I don't want to be the best in any regard because that's also going to remove the challenge and make the game unfun. Challenging game is fun because it's challenging, and I want PvP to be balanced and challenging. And I think this is kind of the mistake they made in Season of Discovery, is they focused a lot on PvE output, and that kind of hurt PvP because Vanilla's PvP is actually quite balanced from class to class. Maybe not spec to spec, but class to class, it's quite balanced. Pretty much every class, if you get good enough, can beat every other class with a very few exceptions. So the balance in PvP is quite close in original vanilla, and I'm not sure I could say the same. Well, maybe you could say the same in Season of Discovery, but that's been mainly because everyone can one-shot everyone, so it's not really because there's a huge amount of outplay potential in any spec. Maybe you're just dying to anything, and that's also quite uninteresting PvP in my opinion. But I do think you need some sort of PvE output just to make sure that some specs aren't as so bad that they won't even be like just as they are right now in vanilla. You will not bring a enhancement shaman. You won't bring a retribution paladin if you're a serious guild. You won't bring a shadow priest. And those specs, in my opinion, should be able to be brought, right? And that has to come down to PvE output. So in that sense, I kind of do agree that, but it shouldn't be the primary source of balancing. It should be a secondary source of balancing. PvP should be the primary source. And the way you balance PvE is kind of what they did already in vanilla, where say you wanna do Molten Core, right? There are a few bosses in Molten Core where you have to bring certain classes. And I know a lot about Hunter, so I'm gonna bring up Hunter in this case. You have to trank shot. You have to have trank shot on at least, I'd say 2 Hunters, right? To keep some of the bosses not enraging or frenzying. And that's a genius way of making sure that every class has a role in a raid scenario. The same goes for Rogue in Blackwing Lair, and also Hunter. You need to bring rogues because the suppression room, that's where the rogue shines. You can't really get through the suppression room unless you have a bunch of rogues going out and lowering the pillars with their, what is it, lockpicking? I think it's lockpicking they use to do that. So they have to have skilled up lockpicking, and you have to have the rogues, and they need to be in stealth. So they're sneaking around and lowering these pillars, making sure that the raid can move through the suppression room in Blackwing Lair, which is just an awesome way of making sure that every class has a reason and has a specific role in a raid environment. And again, hunters are brought for their tranquilizing shot to reduce frenzy on several bosses. And if you just expand that mindset out to different classes, so that you make sure that, okay, we need to bring this and that class to make sure, or this and that spec to make sure that we can get through these obstacles in this raid. And that's a more, not only for the player is it more interesting, but it's also more interesting in a gameplay sense. So it doesn't just become numbers, right? A lot of the vanilla and Classic Plus crowd, they're not the zoomers from retail. We don't really care that much about raw output. We care about niche use cases. We care about having a specific role in a raid where you feel like you're really wanted or needed for this role, and it's gonna feel way more awesome. I hope you get what I'm saying, what I mean by this. I think doubling down on something like that is a way better source of balancing. All right, moving on. Does dual spec positively impact how you play the game? I say yes, they did, and they added this in the anniversary realms as well. And I think it's a great idea. They should do that in Classic Plus as well. Would you like to see greater respec flexibility in Classic Plus? 56% says just dual spec, and then 14.8% say yes, treble spec, and then 12.9% say yes, change tenants when in rested areas, and we have 7.3% say yes, change tenants anywhere out of combat, and 8.2% say no. They do not want to see greater flexibility. What do I think? I think dual spec for sure, yeah. I agree with the majority, at least that. But I also think that triple spec probably wouldn't hurt. People who enjoy both aspects of the game, right? Both PvE and PvP, they want this part of the game to be very, very accessible. They want to be able to swap between specs. And why should they get punished for that? You wouldn't want to punish your player base for playing the different aspects of the game, right? You kind of want to reward that. But you also want to make sure that it isn't abused. And for that reason, I'd say triple spec, mostly because then probably not going to misuse it as much. That also opens up for hybrid classes to not only heal, but also DPS and tank. So if you have a paladin or if you have a druid, say, you have access to 3 different setups, that's going to make it easier to find tanks when looking for dungeons and raids, and it's going to be easy to find healers as well, because now the druid can not only he can level as a DPSer, but if the tank is needed, then he can swap to tank spec, or if a healer is needed, then he can swap to a healer spec, given that he has the gear for it, of course. All right, if weapon skill were to be made less meta defining, tick which changes alternatives are appealing, and 25% votes vanilla is fine. 27% votes add more items with plus skill. 22% says skill enchants, so you can get enchants that increase your weapon skill. And 28% says quest change to learn additional skills. Oh no, please. These quests are just going to be mandatory, so that's not really an option then. So it's not that interesting. 23% says remove weapon skill ratios. 7% say consumable plus weapon skill. And 34% say just make weapon skill irrelevant beyond 300 plus. And I would like to say there should be another option that just says just make weapon skill disappear. I just think that there's no real interesting gameplay revolved around weapon skill. It also feels bad if you have to equip a lower level item like a much lower level item to just be able to hit the boss. And why does skill level not apply to ranged attacks? It only applies to melee attacks, but as soon as you go to ranged attacks, they don't get glancing blows. So meaning hunters, bow and crossbow and gun. You can't get glancing blows in those, so plus skill only gives more hit chance. In my opinion, either change it completely to something more interesting, kind of like what they did with expertise. I think that was a bit more interesting. But then again, I think just having hit is fine, and then increasing hit, having items that increase percentage hit or maybe hit rating if you want a rating system that's more scalable. But I'm not a fan of weapon skill at all. I think you should be able to swap to different weapons and not having to go hit low level mobs for an eternity to be able to hit a mob that's the same level as you. Like if you're at level 60, you get a new weapon and you don't have weapon skill in it, then you're kind of fucked for the next many hours because it's kind of useless for you. All right, moving on to the next one. Which stat system is most ideal for Classic Plus? And 53% votes vanilla, percentage hit, percentage crit, etc. 20% say TPC, ratings, armor pen, spell hit, melee hit, spell power, healing power. Yet it wasn't really called spell power, right? TPC is the same as vanilla in terms of spell damage and healing plus healing. That's in Ref, they changed that. And then 25% say Wrath of Lich King, ratings, hit, haste, crit, spell power, armor, penetration. And there is a charm in getting an item that's easy to understand and easy to read, which is percentage based. Right, is some easy things to understand with that. And I probably agree a little bit with the majority on this one. I'd probably just stick with this. But I can see how, especially once you get next geared, the amount of percentage crit and percentage plus hit you have going beyond this point is just gonna get crazy. The amount of crit and plus hit everyone will be getting. But I think most people will also argue that there should be more power creep than next gear. The rest should be horizontal progression and not vertical progression. So maybe it's not such a bad thing to just have hit percentage and percentage crit. But if we had to change things, I say I'd also go with the Wrath of Lich King system, mainly because the difference between spell power and plus healing plus damage on gear. Spell power is just a lot more easy to understand. So spell power is just spell power, and it applies to healing as well as applies to spells. All right, next up is professions. Would you like to see higher impact / best in slot items as a result of crafting in Classic Plus? And majority votes yes, and I very much agree with this. 25% are neutral and 15% votes no. And I actually do think that the best gear in the game should come from professions. That's going to keep professions way more relevant. But I have a caveat to add to that. It should be much like it is with Hand of Ragnaros. Because in order to craft Hand of Ragnaros, yes, you need blacksmithing, yes, you need very expensive and specific materials. But you also need to get into raid to get these materials. Some of these materials you can't buy on the auction house. You need to get them from a specific drop. And if you just take that logic and then add that logic to a bunch of other weapons, but making it easier to obtain these rare drops. So because they're not legendary, maybe they're just epic items, right? You would want those to drop a lot more often. Then yeah, I think professions should be the way to get and maybe even upgrade to the best gear. And I think that's a really good way of making sure that all professions stay relevant even way into the late game. And that's how I think the game should be built. It's always best for a game if the best gear in the game comes from professions or crafting. Next up, should professions attempt to give the player unique but somewhat equal power bonuses? If they're talking about what they did in, was it Cataclysm? Where if you had skinning, then you'd get a percentage more crit chance. And if you had mining, then you'd get a bit more stamina. But they did that in some expansion, and that's a bad idea. But equal power in a different way, in terms of just the profession and what it can do, then I say yeah. But I wouldn't want some arbitrary stat attached to my profession. I'd much rather have them balance professions in other ways than straight up giving them like player power. So that's my take. Should engineering be changed so it's less mandatory for PvE? Why are they stopping here at PvE? Why not at PvP as well? The majority votes yes, 33% votes no, and I don't know, honestly. I think I agree somewhat, but I wouldn't want engineering to get any weaker, because I just want to see buffs to the other professions to bring them up to par with engineering. Because I think the engineering items, they bring a lot of interesting stuff to PvP. And nerfing that would be, in my opinion, sad. But adding more interesting stuff to the other professions to make up for the gap between those two those professions would be the ideal way to go. So, but I think what they're talking about here in PvE is mainly separate charges, right? And how strong they are in PvE. So we're talking about, I think we're mainly talking about one item. And of course you could just go in and change that one item. But that's just my take. Season of Mastery and Season of Discovery brought changes to gathering and crafting. Would changes of this nature be good for Classic Plus? 60% say yes, I'd like to see changes of similar impact in Classic Plus. 26% say yes, but in a reduced capacity. And we have 8.9% say no, but they were good for a seasonal server, and 4% say no, they were bad changes. I think in Season of Mastery, they did one thing that was kind of smart to combat botting and to combat hackers or cheating, which was making sure that the Black Lotus was a percentage drop from high level herbs instead of this rare spawn out in the world. And I actually think I like that idea. But the amount of elemental fire and elemental earth that was dropping from mining nodes was a bit too much. I should scale it down a bit. But other than that, then yes, I agree. I think some of the changes were good. I think especially the one with Black Lotus to add it to high-level herbs, just like arcane crystals are at high-level mining nodes. And then we're moving on to Azeroth and the world. How should any new zones affect Azeroth? 12% say more areas to level from 10 to 60, and then 8.5% say high-level zones for live PvP or PvE events. 19.7% say save them and utilize them as big content patches, attractions like Silithus AQ. And then we have the 60% or 59.3% that says all of the above. So the majority would like pretty much all of this to be added to the game. And I kind of agree. More areas to level, yep, do that. High level zones for live PvE and PvE events, yes, we'd like that. And also big content patches with attractions like Silithus and AQ. Yeah, also that. We like it all. Just try to make sure that one zone doesn't become the go-to zone for everything. Other zones, even though you're bringing new zones, the old zones should still stay relevant and populated. Incursions is a great example of making all other content redundant. Please don't do that. Just make horizontal progression. Make sure that when you add something, it stays in line with everything else. So you don't make all the other stuff redundant. That's a retail mindset. In retail, you only play the newest patch of the game, right? The rest is irrelevant. You have all your catch-up. You have everything to do in the newest patch of the game, while all the rest is just forgotten, not played anymore. That's a horrible way to develop a game, and it's a huge waste of developer time and money and effort. Why not be a little bit more smart about it and then just say, okay, how can we keep these old raids and these old zones and these old dungeons relevant throughout the entire lifespan of the game? That's how you do horizontal progression. So with that in mind, I say yes, all of the above. Would a general world enrichment of new rare spawns, rewarding chests, leveling events be a benefit to Azeroth? And 73.4% say yes. We have a 5% who say no, and 21.3% not necessary. I say yeah. Rare spawns are already in vanilla, but it's not rewarding to kill them, because what's the reward? You get a gray item. If you say, okay, you're probably going to need a friend if you're trying to fight it at the same level as you. If you're below, maybe 3 friends. If you're above, maybe you can solo it. And then make sure that for sure it at least drops a green item, maybe 2 green items, and maybe also quite often drops a blue item. And just make sure the rare spawns are really rare. So, there are a long time between the spawns, so you can't just go around and farm the rares, but those are kind of rare. And then maybe even a guaranteed blue item depending on the rarity of the mob. So it's going to be interesting to try and look for these mobs out in the world, which again goes back to what I've been saying, especially if you have rare spawns in the late game. People will be running around looking for these rare spawns. That in turn will make it so that the world feels alive and you get organic PvP in the world. Rewarding chests, leveling events. Yeah, I don't know what they mean about leveling events, but rewarding chests goes hand in hand with rare spawns. Rewarding chest, just like the Gurubashi Arena chest, which is really a nice world PvP thing as well. So yeah, more stuff like that for sure. I agree, yes. Are you a fan of scheduled events occurring in Azeroth? Talking about the Gurubashi Arena? Yes, I am. Select how the developers should consider revamping parts of the reputation system. 40% votes yes in terms of rewards and their importance. 55% say yes, make them more engaging to complete with quests, hand-ins. And then 20% say yes, make them easier to complete, but their rewards are fine as they are. 11%, 11.7 say the system is its factions and their rewards are fine as is. And 24.6% make the grinds worse, but make them account-wide. And I do think that some of the rewards could be better, like in just looking at how much effort it takes to farm a reputation just to get a mediocre item that's not really that useful. That made it really uninteresting for me to do, while some classes benefit hugely from, say, the Furbok healing pouch for druids and some items that are quite good in PvP, but more of those I think could be added to the existing reputations in the game. And if they add additional reputations, I think also some reputations are really hard to grind, or really grindy, like the Furbok in Fellwood. You're just killing mobs and it's really boring, and others are a lot easier to grind. So I think take a look at the hardest reps to grind and maybe make them a little bit easier, and take a look at the easiest reps to grind, maybe make them a little bit harder. That's my take. And then maybe look at the rewards. I don't want to overkill rewards, but there are some things that are kind of mandatory for many classes, like Altric Valley reputation is kind of mandatory for really many classes because there's just so many great rewards. And it's also quite easy to get exalted. You do that within the first few weeks of Altric Valley release. So I'm while the rotation for Warzone Gulch and Arathi Basin is a lot harder. I don't think I've ever gotten in vanilla exalted with Warzone Gulch. So definitely they could look into how much rep are you getting from winning Warzone Gulch, and maybe look at some of the rewards you get from there, compare them to Altric Valley and others out in the world as well. So that's my take. Does Classic's flight path system require optimizing? Majority says yes, speed it up, make smarter trips, and 27% votes no, I like a scenic flight. And I kind of agree with no, I like scenic flight, but I also I don't want smarter trips. Don't make smarter trips, but maybe speed it up just slightly. I think you still want flying with the flight path to be the fastest, like way faster than just mounting up and traversing there. Like, isn't that the point? I think things are already really slow in vanilla. So yeah, slight speed bump, I wouldn't mind that, but please keep the flights very scenic. I don't want just a straight line to... I like it going, I don't know, back and forth and making sure you fly over places that are interesting. So if you want to sit there and watch yourself fly there, there's still some, like, it's not just a whatever scenery, it's some thought has been put into the flights, which that's one of the very iconic things about vanilla, I think. Making sure that you really get to see the world from above when you fly, because there are no flying, you can't get flying mounts, and I wouldn't want that to be added, just to put that note in there. But in turn, I would like the flight paths to be beautiful, interesting, scenic. Would any version of flying be acceptable in Classic Plus? And the majority says not at all. 7% votes yes. They want the regular flying, where you can buy a flying mount. Some say, how much is that? 3% say yes, buy temporary flying from Taxi Masters. And then yes, but just 100% movement. I think this one is what I vote. I'm with the 3% here, and that's because I've already experienced it in Turtle WoW. And what they did in Turtle WoW is, if you complete some little quests, then in Goldshire and also in Razor Hill, it is, I think, you can feed a griffin or a Viren some meat, and then you can mount it for 30 seconds and you can fly around. I think it's a funny little thing. This shouldn't be something that I think you should be able to do everywhere, but maybe in the early levels where you don't have a mount and you're on foot all the time, maybe being able to rent a mount, maybe not a flying mount, just maybe a ground mount for a small fee, or maybe you can ride a griffin for I don't know, 20, 30 seconds so that you can get somewhere would be fine. That's just my take. Is it a negative effect that new quests and zones might result in not visiting portions of Azeroth during your leveling journey? Majority votes no, and 36% vote yes. And I'm quite unsure about this, but I think I agree with the majority. I could see how it could make parts of the world feel maybe empty, because you're already used to, Stranglephone Vale and Tenaris. Those are kind of hotspots for many players where they gather up. There are a lot of world PvP, but as long as enough people would be playing, and you can always collapse layers, so I don't really think that's an issue. So I agree with the majority here. I'd say no to that one. Should Azeroth have more graveyards implemented? Vast majority, 78% votes yes, 21.8% vote no. Maybe a few more graveyards. Just looking at the places where there's the longest death run, that's where you should maybe think about, okay, maybe add one more graveyard. But you don't want to add too many, because world PvP only feels good if when you kill someone, they don't just resurrect straight away. It's not a battleground, right? So it's you kill someone and then that's it. You have the space or the area for yourself for a while. You can get full health, you can get full whatever, and not worry about them just spawning right behind you within a few seconds. It should be fair that if you win a fight, you're allowed to get your bearings, you're allowed to get full health, you're allowed to recover fully before those same people you ganked can potentially gank you or engage you in fight again. So again, as you can always hear, I'm always a little bit focused on world PvP. The majority of people play on PvP servers, and I think there's a reason for that. All right, moving on to guilds. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I had to break this video up into a series, or else the video would be way too long. So once each episode is out, I'll put links to them in the description below of this video. So check out the description or a notification on screen now, and I'll see you in the next one.